Israel Adesanya's rise to become UFC champion was one of the most exciting feats we have ever seen in the sport, but the fall-off from his championship status was rapid and devastating. The once undefeated UFC middleweight champion has now lost 3 fights in a row, with many fans wondering if he will ever win a fight in the UFC again. But first, let's go back to the very beginning of Israel Adesanya's career. Israel began his combat sports journey as a kickboxer, putting up an impressive record of 75 wins with only 4 losses. 2 of those losses came from future UFC rival Alex Poatan Pereira. Fighting out of his preferred weight class, middleweight, or 185 pounds, he began his MMA career with 2 first-round knockouts in other promotions before he was immediately signed to the UFC, where he began one of the most exciting, hyped, and dominant title runs in UFC history. Adesanya would find himself 5-0 in the UFC, with victories against Rob Wilkinson, Marvin Vettori, and longtime UFC gatekeeper Brad Tavares. He then KO'd 3-time NCAA Div 2 All-American wrestler Derek Brunson in the very first round. Exactly 366 days after making his UFC debut, he found himself facing off against once idol Anderson the Spider Silva. Anderson Silva was considered by most the GOAT of the UFC middleweight division, and this fight was mostly seen as the passing of the torch to Adesanya. Adesanya easily defeated Silva by 3-round decision, setting himself up for an interim middleweight title fight versus a dangerously tough and slick boxer, number 4 ranked middleweight Kelvin Gastelum. In this fight, Adesanya showed he had championship-level heart by eating big shots from Gastelum, including a huge head kick. This viral clip of him in between the 4th and 5th rounds, where we can see him mouth the sentence, "I'm prepared to die," shows just how deep his championship mentality ran. After winning this fight via unanimous decision, Israel Adesanya's hype grew to an all-time high. This fight was an absolute bar banger and is now in the UFC Fight Wing Hall of Fame. The next fight for Israel Adesanya was obvious and was considered by many his biggest test yet. The undisputed middleweight champion, Robert the Reaper Whittaker. Whittaker was undefeated in his last 9 UFC bouts, putting up impressive wins over Derek Brunson, Ronaldo Souza, and Yoel Romero twice. Full of confidence and sure of his ability to become undisputed UFC middleweight champion, Israel Adesanya put on one of the most memorable and unique walkouts in UFC history. And then put on an absolutely crazy performance, brutally knocking down Whittaker in the dying seconds of round 1, before finishing the job in round 2, knocking out Robert Whittaker cold, unifying the middleweight belts, and becoming undisputed middleweight champion for the first time in his career.
He's got to be very careful.
Whittaker nearly out on his feet. Adesanya trying to close it out. Israel Adesanya is the undisputed king of the middleweights.
Man, every time Rob jumped in there.
5 months later, Israel Adesanya was ready for his first title defense versus Yoel Romero, who was mostly discussed as an undeserved title challenger as he had lost 2 in a row and hadn't won a fight in the UFC since the same night Israel Adesanya debuted. This fight has gone down to be one of the worst fights in UFC history, and if not for Adesanya's next fight, this could be labeled as the beginning of the end of the hype train of the last stylebender already. Nonetheless, Adesanya edged a unanimous decision victory, with some fans believing that it could have gone Romero's way as they believed he landed the more damaging shots. but just around the corner got MMA fans excited for Adesanya's next title defense, as he was to face rising undefeated contender Paulo Costa. The expectations of this fight were mostly mixed, with some saying Costa could walk through Izzy's punches and get the finish, while others were thinking Costa would get finished by Izzy's slick striking ability on the outside. Ultimately, the latter group's opinion was exactly what would happen, as Adesanya completely dismantled and humiliated Costa.
Knockdown for Adesanya. Costa trying to recover. That is it. Wow. Still undisputed. Quick night at the office for the champion Israel Adesanya.
It was after this fight, fans started noticing a bump on Izzy's pec. Izzy had never popped for PED usage in his MMA career, so it seemed unlikely that this was something to do with a banned substance, but fans still speculated. After beating Paulo Costa and securing his third title defense, Adesanya would be given the chance to move up to light heavyweight in a potential double champion crowning fight against Jan Blachowicz. Jan Blachowicz was the current light heavyweight champion. The fight would take place at the UFC Apex, a venue created by the UFC to still host fights during the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, this was during the pandemic, so this venue had no fans and also had a smaller octagon that would likely not be in favor of the title challenger Israel Adesanya, who is coming into this fight the smaller opponent and the rangier striker. With fans once again being split 50-50 on who would win this fight, Jan Blachowicz came in, beating Israel Adesanya, utilizing his wrestling game in crucial moments of the later rounds and even getting the better of Adesanya in the striking game, checking Adesanya's leg kicks and countering Izzy's attacks, handing the last stylebender his first loss in the UFC. Izzy was praised for his efforts moving up and fighting at a 20-pound weight disadvantage and ultimately giving himself a chance to win. In the end, he still could go back and defend his middleweight championship. And a familiar face had put up a 5-fight win streak in the UFC after his first loss to Adesanya. Marvin Vettori was back and full of Italian rage from the split decision loss to Adesanya from 3 years ago. Adesanya once again defeated Vettori with ease by unanimous decision, winning all 5 rounds 50-45 on all 3 judges' scorecards, ending Vettori's win streak and title run. Familiar faces quickly became a theme in Adesanya's career, as one of his biggest rivals from his kickboxing days, as per mentioned earlier, had just signed with the UFC. As we waited for Pereira to run through the UFC competition and get to a title opportunity, another past opponent of Israel Adesanya's had racked up a 3-fight win streak since his last loss to Izzy. Robert the Reaper Whittaker will get a chance to redeem himself against the middleweight champ. A lot of fans at this stage were rooting for Bobby Knuckles to get his belt back and expected him to develop a better game plan in the wrestling department to get the better of Adesanya. Ultimately, Whittaker did have a better game plan, landing 4 takedowns in the fight, but that was just not quite enough to dethrone the champ, and he ultimately didn't do enough in the damage striking department to get the judge's nod and lost a 48-47 unanimous decision to Adesanya. Adesanya wins and picks up his 5th title defense in the middleweight division. Seemingly running out of fresh opponents, Israel Adesanya was matched up against a challenger with some of the most devastating power we have seen in the middleweight division, former heavyweight Jared Cannonier, who was on a 2-fight win streak. The general fanbase expected a finish by Adesanya in this fight, with many fans hoping for an Izzy finish to put all the Izzy's boring haters to bed. But unfortunately for them, Izzy put on another lackluster performance, winning a very slow, rangy striking battle against Jared Cannonier, taking the fight by unanimous decision 49-46. By little fault of his own, and maybe because of the lack of the ability of the title challengers to force Israel Adesanya into a different fight, Adesanya had slowly labeled himself to the general MMA fanbase as a boring champ that coasts his way to decision victories constantly. Meanwhile, on the undercard of this main event, Alex Pereira continued to make statements with a nasty finish on number 9 ranked middleweight contender Sean Strickland. At this point, it was all but official that Adesanya's next opponent would be Pereira. Pereira and Adesanya have history in kickboxing, similar exciting styles, and people were praying for a new exciting champion in Alex Pereira that can save the middleweight division from these constant decision title fights. Most people expected Alex Pereira to be able to find the patented left hook and knock out Izzy, just like he did in kickboxing. Others weren't so sure, saying Izzy has more experience in the wrestling department, and if he has the ability to mix it up, he could decision merchant Pereira like he has done to all the other middleweight contenders. People were also questioning Pereira's experience in MMA, as he had just been fast-tracked to the very top of the UFC based on the previous rivalry between Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira in kickboxing. Israel was putting on a beautiful performance, rocking Alex very bad at the end of round 1 before he was saved by the bell.
Big knee.
Huge right and left at the end of the round.
Izzy was up 3 rounds to 1 going into round 5, and Pereira doubters were proving to be right, and the expectations were ever so clear. Alex Pereira needed a 5th round finish to become the new champion.
To the body tonight. Oh, here's that left hook.
He hurt him bad.
Oh, now a right. Adesanya's on one of the legs. 2 more. Down goes the champion. Pereira trying to close the show. That'll do it.
Israel Adesanya was officially dethroned as the UFC middleweight champion and was 0-3 against his biggest rival in combat sports and seemingly at this point an unbeatable opponent, Alex Pereira. With Israel Adesanya's dominant championship reign and Alex Pereira seemingly snatching victory out of the jaws of defeat in the final round of their very first fight in the UFC, an immediate rematch was booked 5 months later at UFC 287, Adesanya vs. Pereira 2. With the expectations being mainly the same going into this fight, everyone was left wondering if Alex Pereira would be able to find that shot again. The first round went Izzy's way with him controlling the distance and landing the better shots on the outside. However, in the second round, Alex Pereira came back with vengeance and had Israel Adesanya hurt badly pushed up against the fence, as it looked to be all but over for Israel Adesanya as Poatan had him backed up against the cage while the last stylebender defended an onslaught of devastating strikes from the new champion.
Pereira so dangerous. Oh! Counter right from Adesanya. Pereira down and out. Order restored. Adesanya has finally done it.
He got him bad.
Israel Adesanya
He got him bad.
can finally lay claim to a win over Alex Pereira.
In one of the greatest knockout comebacks we have ever seen, Israel Adesanya slept Alex Pereira out cold, finally defeating the man who beat him in kickboxing, followed him to the UFC, and stole his middleweight championship belt. Adesanya had finally gotten redemption over the boogeyman who he could never seem to get the victory over. It seemed imminent that a trilogy between these two bitter rivals would happen in the UFC. But Alex Pereira had other plans. The weight cut was too intense, and he wanted to make a run in the light heavyweight division. At this point, who could be next for Izzy? He had put up wins against almost all of the top contenders in the division, even defeating some of them twice. But rising contender Dricus du Plessis had put up an impressive performance over Whitaker, beating him handedly via strikes in the second round. This also became an increasingly intriguing matchup as Adesanya and DDP began to have some serious beef outside the ring, with DDP making the statement that he wants to become the first fighter out of Africa to win a belt. Now, as a blanket statement, this could create some controversy as we have Kamaru Usman, Francis Ngannou, and Israel Adesanya, who are all champions with African heritage and backgrounds. But DDP would provide clarification to this comment, stating that he wanted to be the first champion who actively trained out of a gym that was in Africa. Usman trained in America, and Ngannou trained in France, and Izzy trained out of New Zealand at City Kickboxing. But Dricus du Plessis just fought in July, and Izzy was targeting a September return in which DDP would not be ready. This left one man, and one man only, to challenge for the belt.
Here's the thing, Helen. Let me tell you about Izzy. Here's the thing about women, you guys. Here's the thing about Instagram. Here's the thing, guys. WNBA. Every dog has his day. Besides Izzy's dog.
Number 10 ranked middleweight and controversial UFC fighter Sean Strickland had won his last 2 UFC fights and was all there was left for a new challenge for Israel Adesanya. Everyone was completely writing off Strickland in this fight, saying he had no chance to win and that this was an easy additional title defense ruby on Adesanya's belt. During fight week, Strickland completely clowned Adesanya on the mic, bringing up Izzy's like for anime and his relationship with his dog. MMA Guru also had an extremely viral video during this time that outed Adesanya and gave ammo to Strickland for the highly anticipated pre-fight press conference.
Let's fucking go! Let's go! Here's the thing about the Chinaman, you guys. Come on, Izzy, give me something, bro. What the
When you argue with a fool, those who are watching can't tell who's who.
Oh, there we go. Hey, you know what? You know what, man? The moment I post a video of me jerking off my dog, then we'll put some credibility to that. Izzy is on a world stage, and he goes up in the cage to call out Dricus, and he race baits him. This is the kind of champion we have, and it's a goddamn shame.
Israel Adesanya was never good on the mic, and as everyone expected, Strickland got the best of him here. But the mic is not a scorecard, and UFC fans still had Strickland completely written off when they finally squared up in the octagon. That was until 4 minutes and 34 seconds of round number 1 when we saw this.
Adesanya back to his feet. Strickland applying a wall of pressure. Adesanya circles out. A major moment only for the underdog. Round 1 to the challenger.
In one of the most shocking sights we have ever seen, Sean Strickland landed a huge right hand that knocked Israel Adesanya down and almost finished the champion. Adesanya bounced back and took round 2, but Strickland's pressure did not slow down for the entirety of the fight, and in one of the biggest upsets in UFC history, Sean Strickland defeated Israel Adesanya 49-46 on all 3 judges' scorecards and became the new middleweight champion. In a quick 4-month turnaround, the UFC booked Dricus du Plessis vs. Sean Strickland for Sean's first title defense. This was a relatively no-risk fight for the UFC because no matter who wins, they can book Israel Adesanya against that champion, Strickland for an immediate rematch, and Dricus du Plessis because of the ongoing beef outside of the octagon. Dricus du Plessis would end up winning that fight, and Israel Adesanya versus Dricus would be booked. Israel Adesanya was coming off almost a year layoff since his loss to Sean Strickland, but he would still face Dricus du Plessis at UFC 305. People continue to underestimate DDP due to his unorthodox style and the lack of fundamentals he shows in his game. But one thing we now know for sure, his style works, and it works well. Yet the MMA fanbase did not know what to expect with this fight, with some leading Adesanya's way and others buying into the goofiness of the new middleweight champ. In yet another super close fight, with one judge even having it Adesanya's way going into the 4th round, Dricus du Plessis continued with the success in the grappling department and found a 4th round submission victory via rear naked choke, handing Adesanya back-to-back losses for the first time ever in his UFC career. After 12 consecutive title fights for Adesanya, It was tough to know what was next for him at the time, but the consensus was relatively clear, with most people wanting him to fight down the rankings for the first time in his career that wasn't a title fight and face an up-and-coming contender. The middleweight division looks completely different than it once did when Adesanya first became champ. We have contenders such as Nasruddin Imavov, Caio Borralho, Khamzat Chimaev, Brendan Allen, Rainer de Ritter, and Anthony Hernandez making big jumps in the rankings and itching for a big step up. The UFC ultimately went with number 5 ranked middleweight contender Nasruddin Imavov, who had won his last 3 fights in a row. A lot of MMA fans were still betting Adesanya had the tools in the striking department to get it done against Imavov. And just like every other fight Izzy has had in the UFC, he was the betting favorite. UFC fans who were previously praying the once dominant champ would lose were now hoping to see his comeback. But unfortunately, after looking dominant and winning the first round on all 3 judges' scorecards, Nasruddin Imavov landed a huge left hand and put Izzy out.
Oh, big right from Imavov. And he follows up. It's a chef's kiss from Nasruddin Imavov.
After the fight, fans were calling for the end of Izzy's career, that maybe it was time for him to hang it up. But one thing we can say for sure is that Israel Adesanya has had one of the most dominant and successful careers in UFC history. He was one of the most active champions we have ever seen and did not shy away from a fight with anyone. He proved his dominance by taking on contender after contender and beating them time and time again. We now look at champs like Khamzat Chimaev, champions like Ilia Topuria, and we think and we wonder and we wish for the times that we had when Israel Adesanya was constantly in there defending his title. Although his double champ status fell just short, he was praised and respected for his efforts and still went on to put up impressive wins in the UFC middleweight division. This weekend, he faces a new up-and-comer, Joe Pyfer. And once again, the UFC fanbase is rallying around his skills, expecting him to get it done. MMA is an incredibly unforgiving sport, and it's difficult to know when the time to retire is. But one thing is for sure, Israel Adesanya is one of the greatest UFC champions we have ever had.
Presenting the reigning, defending, undisputed UFC middleweight champion of the world, Israel the Last Style Bender Adesanya! Oh, another knockdown! Israel Adesanya knocks Derek Brunson out in round 1.
That's what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen. That's technique. That's the last style bender, folks.
Knockdown for Adesanya!
He's got to be very careful.
Whitaker nearly out on his feet. Adesanya trying to close it out. Israel Adesanya is the undisputed king of the middleweights.
To the leg again.
Oh! Knockdown for Adesanya. That is it.
Wow.
Still undisputed. Quick night at the office for the champion Israel Adesanya. Again. Pereira so dangerous. Oh! Counter right from Adesanya. Pereira down and out. Order restored. Adesanya has finally done it.
He got him bad.
Israel